From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Friday, January 17th. Don't bank on a rate cut in February. That's the warning from economists who say bumper employment figures released on Thursday will have the Reserve Bank running scared. And it could dash the government's hopes of a pre-election rate cut. You can read that story right now at theaustralian.com.au. A long-awaited ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas has fallen over at the 11th hour thanks to political infighting in the Israeli cabinet. So, what now? That's today's episode. On Saturday, a little baby will celebrate his second birthday. But for the second time, that precious milestone will occur in captivity. Kafir Bibas, whose shock of red hair became a symbol of the more than 200 hostages taken by the militant group Hamas on October 7, 2023, will be with his mum and dad, Shiri and Yarden, and his big brother, Ariel. And after a ceasefire deal was tentatively struck between Israel and Hamas, it looked like Kafir and his family could be among the first to return home after 15 long and terrifying months. But now that future is more uncertain than ever after the cabinet of Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu failed to ratify the truce.
A ceasefire deal.
A ceasefire has finally, at last, been agreed.
This is a massive deal, weeks in the making.
The news broke early on Thursday morning.
Finally, after 467 days of war, a ceasefire has been agreed between Israel and Hamas.
After more than a year and thousands of deaths, Israel and Hamas will end their fighting. There were celebrations in the streets of Gaza. World leaders breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the jubilation didn't last long. The deal was set to be ratified at an anticipated meeting of the Israeli cabinet later on Thursday, but that was delayed when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accused Hamas of reneging on parts of the agreement. A senior Hamas official said in a post on Telegram that wasn't the case, adding that the militant group is committed to the ceasefire agreement. The hold-up came down to political infighting in Netanyahu's cabinet. His political future has been threatened by far-right members of his coalition who see concessions made by the PM to bring hostages home as a loss for Israel against their terrorist adversaries. It's complex and this situation is changing quickly. Here's what we know. The deal was expected to happen in 3 stages. First, Israeli forces would begin to withdraw from Gaza's densely populated areas, so displaced Palestinians could return home and humanitarian aid to the region could be ratcheted up. Around 30 hostages taken into the Palestinian territories by Hamas militants during that deadly October 7 massacre were to be freed. The Bibas brothers might have been among them. In return, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners currently held in Israeli jails would have been returned. In stages 2 and 3, it was proposed that Israeli troops would completely withdraw from Gaza, and any remaining hostages would be released before rebuilding could begin in the decimated Gaza Strip. I spoke to The Australian's chief international correspondent Cameron Stewart in the hours before the ceasefire deal was plunged into doubt.
The real challenge, Christian, comes in the second phase of the deal, and that requires the release of the rest of the hostages, but also the declaration of a permanent peace and the removal of all Israeli forces from Gaza. Now, Hamas and Israel are not in agreement at the moment on that aspect. Israel is very reluctant to declare a permanent peace. They want to be able to come in and hit Hamas if they see Hamas rearming in any sense. And Hamas has said it's not going to release all of the hostages until the IDF, the Israeli forces, are completely out of Gaza. And Israel says, no, that won't happen. They won't leave Gaza until the hostages are released. So, look, these might sound small in some ways, but in fact, they're very difficult negotiating positions which have to be resolved for the second phase to succeed. That will be the real test of this agreement.
Several nations played roles in these most recent ceasefire negotiations. Both Joe Biden and Donald Trump have taken credit for finally bringing the truce to fruition. The outgoing president through meticulous diplomacy.
This plan was developed and negotiated by my team and will be largely implemented by the incoming administration.
And the president-elect through brute force.
If those hostages aren't back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East.
Even a vow by linchpin Qatari negotiators to steady the ship couldn't get it over the line. Here's Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani.
We are committed. I believe that it all depends on the parties of the agreement and acting in good faith in that agreement in order to ensure that no collapse happening to that deal.
Cam, what happens if both parties can't agree on the next phase of the deal?
Look, it would be terrible news, obviously, for those hostages who might still be in captivity at that point in time. It would also be terrible news for the Palestinian people because Israel would obviously begin its attacks again, which would lead to civilian casualties. And I think for the Netanyahu government, it would be a very difficult situation. There are lots of Israelis who really want to see a cessation of hostilities. A very interesting point here, though, I think, Kristen, is that there will be a lot of pressure on both the Israeli government and Hamas from Donald Trump as the new president. It will be very much in Trump's interest to keep this peace going and to ensure that each phase of these negotiations continues to progress and deliver ultimately a permanent peace. Trump does not want to see a resumption of hostilities under his watch.
Coming up, what this moment means for Australia. There are more than 14,000 kilometres between Canberra and the Gaza Strip. But yet Australia's capital and the whole nation has felt the effects of the conflict in the Middle East keenly. Through 15 months of fighting, an anti-Semitism crisis has festered in the streets and in the halls of Parliament. Locally, political alliances fractured. Globally, relationships deteriorated. Cam, what are the local implications, do you think, of a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas?
I think that it definitely has local ramifications here in Australia. I mean, we've seen a really absolutely disgraceful increase of anti-Semitism over the past 15 months. I think that state governments, especially the state Labor government in Victoria and the federal government, have really been far too slow to call it out, to stamp it out, and to really take action to prevent it. That has, if you like, encouraged anti-Israeli protesters to embrace anti-Semitism in all forms. Now, the outbreak of peace, let's hope it's permanent peace, in Gaza would certainly lead to a reduction in protests, if not an end to the weekly protests from the pro-Palestinian groups. And you would hope it would reduce the heat and the temperature of the debate here in Australia, and that surely is going to lead to an improvement in what we've seen as far as the terrible harassment of Australian Jews.
There's a federal election due in May. Do you think there'll be an attempt by either side to take this conflict and the Middle East, perhaps more broadly, off the agenda before then?
I think the federal government certainly will be very keen to get this off the agenda because for the Albanese government, it's really been a loser on both counts as far as the local electorate goes, because it certainly has lost a lot of Jewish voters who are very unhappy with what they see as a weak fight against anti-Semitism from the Albanese government, but also a lot of Islamic voters in those Western Sydney seats are annoyed with what they believe is a too pro-Israel position from the Albanese government. So I think the whole conflict in the Middle East has been a loser for the Albanese government. I think electorally they would love to see a ceasefire now so that the issue at least recedes in the minds of many voters such that it won't be as much of a turning point or a voting issue when the election is actually held later this year. But also, I think it'll be interesting to see whether during the election campaign, the opposition leader Peter Dutton continues to push these issues about the government's handling of the Israeli conflict and, of course, its handling of anti-Semitism in Australia. I think Dutton certainly sees this as a vote winner for the Conservatives, and I suspect he will try to keep the issue alive in the public mind at the same time as the Labor government will be trying to reduce the memory of Australians about this issue.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. This situation is moving quickly. For all the latest, visit theaustralian.com.au. Thanks for joining us on The Front this week. Our team is Claire Harvey, Jasper Leake, Leah Zamaglu, Josh Burton, Tiffany Dimmack, Stephanie Coombs, Stella McKenna and me, Kristen Amiet.